In 1963, a team of Turkish and American archaeologists surveyed a hilltop in southeastern Turkey. They found broken limestone slabs sticking out of the ground, a few carved stones, the remnants of what looked like old walls. They noted it in their report, concluded it was a medieval cemetery, and moved on. 31 years later, in 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived at the same hill. He looked at the same stones. He reached a completely different conclusion. What the 1963 team had dismissed as medieval rubble was, Schmidt realized, something almost incomprehensible. He began to excavate, and what he found would force historians to rewrite the story of human civilization from the beginning. The hill is called Göbekli Tepe, in Turkish, Potbelly Hill. It sits near the city of Sanliurfa in southeastern Turkey, on the edge of what was once the most fertile region on Earth. What Schmidt found beneath the surface of that hill had been there for 12,000 years. Not 1,200, not 1,200,000, 12,000 years. The structures at Göbekli Tepe were built around 9,600 BCE, 6,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids, 6,000 years before Stonehenge, 7,000 years before the invention of writing, and at least 1,000 years before anyone, anywhere, began farming. This is not a minor archaeological discovery. This is the oldest known megalithic complex on the surface of the planet. To understand why Göbekli Tepe is so disorienting, you need to understand what 9,600 BCE actually means. This is the very end of the last ice age. The glaciers are retreating. Woolly mammoths still roam parts of Asia. The sea level is still rising from melting ice sheets. Human beings exist, obviously. They've been around for hundreds of thousands of years. But in 9,600 BCE, humans live the same way they've lived for nearly all of that time. They hunt animals. They gather plants. They follow the seasons. They live in small mobile groups. They don't build permanent structures. They don't farm. They don't have cities, writing, governments, or organized religion. At least, that's what we thought. The standard story of civilization goes like this. Agriculture comes first. Farming produces food surpluses. Surpluses allow populations to settle in one place. Settled populations build villages, then cities. Cities develop division of labor. Religion and monuments emerge from this complexity. In this model, you need to have civilization before you can build a temple. Göbekli Tepe was built before any of that existed. The people who carved those pillars and lifted those stones into place were hunter-gatherers. They had no metal tools. They had no pottery. They had no writing. They had no farms, no villages, no governments. And they built something that required hundreds of workers, decades of organized labor, and a level of social coordination that shouldn't have been possible for people living the way they lived. Every assumption we had about the origins of civilization needs to be reconsidered. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe are T-shaped, a distinctive form that appears nowhere in earlier human construction. The largest stand 5.5 meters tall. They weigh between 10 and 20 tons. They were quarried from the limestone plateau a few hundred meters away. You can still see the unfinished pillars lying in the quarry, abandoned mid-cut, giving us a clear picture of how the work was done. Workers cut channels around the desired shape using flint tools, stone cutting stone. When the channels were deep enough, they levered the pillar free, somehow moved it across the rocky terrain, and erected it in a circular enclosure with other pillars. Ground-penetrating radar has identified at least 20 such enclosures beneath the hill. Only 6 have been excavated. The full scale of what's down there is unknown. The enclosures are arranged with 2 larger central pillars flanked by smaller pillars around a circle. The central pillars in some enclosures have carved arms, hands, and what appear to be belts, suggesting they represent beings, not animals, something more like people, or gods. There is no sign of permanent habitation at Göbekli Tepe, no hearths, no houses, no storage pits for food, no evidence that anyone lived here. This was not a settlement. This was a destination. People came here to do something, and then they left. To feed the workers during construction would have required massive quantities of food. Bone analysis from the site shows enormous quantities of wild animal bones, suggesting massive communal feasts. Hundreds of animals were slaughtered and eaten here, over and over, during the construction period. Someone organized all of this. Someone decided what to build, directed the quarrying, coordinated the movement of 20-ton stones, and fed the workers. We have no idea who that was. The most immediately striking thing about Göbekli Tepe is not the scale of the construction. It's the carvings. The pillars are covered in relief sculptures of animals, rendered with an artistry and confidence that looks almost impossibly sophisticated for 9,600 BCE. Foxes appear most frequently, scorpions rendered in perfect detail, snakes coiling along the edges of pillars, cranes, vultures with outstretched wings, wild boar, aurochs, the enormous wild cattle that were the most dangerous prey animal in this part of the world, spiders, ducks. The animals are not decorative. They carry symbolic, religious, or cosmological meaning that we can only partially reconstruct. And then there is Pillar 43. Sometimes called the Vulture stone, it is the most complex and most debated carving at the entire site. A vulture with one wing outstretched, as if displaying or descending. Below the vulture, a headless human figure, a sphere balanced on the wing. Scholars have argued that Pillar 43 depicts a sky burial, the practice of leaving human bodies exposed on hilltops for vultures to consume. If this interpretation is correct, Pillar 43 is the oldest known narrative scene in human art, not a random collection of images. A story, a ritual preserved in stone 12,000 years ago. And the central T-shaped pillars in several enclosures have carved human hands, forearms, and what appear to be belts with fox-skin loincloths. They are not quite human and not quite animal. The closest modern parallel might be a deity. We are looking at the world's first known depictions of gods. Klaus Schmidt spent 20 years at Göbekli Tepe before he died in 2014, with only 5% of the site excavated. In those 20 years, he developed a theory that overturned one of the most fundamental assumptions in the history of human civilization. Standard archaeology held that the sequence was agriculture, then settlements, then surplus, then religion, then monuments. Schmidt proposed the opposite. Religion. The need to gather, to perform rituals, to honor gods or ancestors, came first. And the effort of maintaining a religious site, of feeding hundreds of workers during construction, of returning year after year for communal feasts, drove the development of agriculture. The oldest evidence of domesticated einkorn wheat, the ancestor of all modern wheat, was found 30 kilometers from Göbekli Tepe. The dates align almost exactly with the construction of the complex. Schmidt's argument: the hunter-gatherers who built Göbekli Tepe needed to feed workers. To feed workers reliably, they needed to grow food. Growing food, rather than hunting and gathering it, was how agriculture was invented. First came the temple. Then came the city. If Schmidt is right, and the evidence is increasingly in his favor, then civilization is a product of religion. The entire urban, agricultural, literate world we live in began not with someone inventing the plow, but with someone deciding, on a hilltop in Turkey, to carve a stone pillar and erect it facing the sunrise. Around 8,000 BCE, 1,600 years after it was built, Göbekli Tepe was buried, not abandoned, not left to fall into ruin, deliberately, intentionally, systematically buried under tons of rubble, animal bones, and stone debris. The burial was organized. Rubble was brought in from outside and poured into the enclosures until the tops of the pillars were submerged. The entire hilltop was raised by meters of carefully deposited fill. Why would you bury something you had spent generations building? Something that had served as the center of your spiritual life for over 1,000 years? Perhaps the site's ritual power had been exhausted. Perhaps there was a religious revolution, and the burial was an act of intentional erasure. Perhaps the burial was itself a sacrifice, the greatest offering a community could make. What we know is that the burial perfectly preserved the site. The pillars survived intact for 12,000 years because they were sealed underground. The people who buried Göbekli Tepe, whatever their intention, gave us a gift across the millennia. Klaus Schmidt died in 2014. He had excavated 5% of Göbekli Tepe. The other 95% remains underground, waiting. Ground-penetrating radar shows at least 20 enclosures. Only 6 have been opened. The radar shows pillars larger than any found so far. Enclosures more complex than any we have yet seen. We don't know what's down there. Göbekli Tepe is 12,000 years old. It was built by people we cannot name, who worshipped gods we cannot identify, who spoke a language that left no trace, who buried their most sacred site for reasons we can only guess at. And yet, when you look at the carvings, at the fox staring from a limestone pillar, at the vulture with outstretched wings, at the carved hands reaching down the sides of a T-shaped stone. You feel something. These were people, not so different from us. They looked at the world and felt it needed explaining. They felt that something unseen moved behind the visible surface of things. They gathered, they worked together, they made something beautiful and permanent and meaningful. They were doing something that every human civilization since has also done, and they were doing it 12,000 years ago. Before farming, before cities, before writing, before Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, Rome, before all of it. The world's first temple was built on a hill in Turkey by people who had nothing, except the same thing we have, the need to believe in something larger than themselves.